And Vietnam was forced to stand on its own. US was still heavily hostile. And US being hostile means the rest of the West was hostile. The only Western presence they had was Sweden, this innocuous presence. And so that forced them to reform. But what had been built during those economically very depressing years, but socially quite advanced, and this is, you have to give credit where it's due. They did invest in education. They did invest in health. They did invest in infrastructure. They did invest in female empowerment and gender equity. Look at this across the formerly socialist economies. The gender female dimension just pops out, right?
Swarnim Waglé is a distinguished leader in the economic and political landscape of Nepal. He currently serves as an elected member of the Federal Parliament in Nepal and also chairs the Institute for Integrated Development Studies, a well-established South Asian think tank. He is also the former Chief Economic Advisor at the UNDP Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific, RBAP, in New York, which covers 36 countries. During his 3-year tenure at the National Planning Commission in Nepal, he played a crucial role in shaping national development strategies, coordinating policies, and leading recovery efforts after the 2015 earthquake and 2017 flood. With over 2 decades in international development, he has worked with prestigious institutions like the World Bank and UNDP. Apart from his professional commitments, Dr. Waglé is active in academia, advising non-profit organizations and contributing to the World Bank's South Asia championing and visioning process. He holds an impressive academic background, including a doctorate in economics from the Australian National University, a master's in international development from Harvard University, and a BSc Econ from the London School of Economics. He joins us today on our latest episode of Advocata Conversations.
Swarnim Waglé, welcome to Advocata Conversation. Let's start with hearing your story.
From my birth onwards. So I was born in a very remote mountain village in the Himalayas in the western part of Nepal. It's a place called Gorkha, which actually is the beginning of the Nepali. Well, we were a kingdom for a while and then now a republic. But the original king of Gorkha is the one who sort of built modern Nepal in 1769, right? And we were never colonized, unlike the rest of South Asia. So I was born there, but I was very lucky to have had the opportunity to get schooled in Kathmandu, the capital city. And the substantial portion of my high school was at a school called Budanilkantha School in Kathmandu, a residential boarding school for boys, often styled as the Eton of the Himalayas because the monarch at the time wanted to send his sons, princes, future kings there. But at the same time, it was an amazing social experiment. Nepal is a fairly ethnically diverse and caste-ridden society. So in a country of 30 million now, we have almost 120, 125 different groups. So this was an experiment conceived 50 years ago to have all sorts of diverse kids from all over the country. So those who could pay, they would pay the full fees. But those who couldn't pay, the state would pay for them. Right? So it was an amazing experiment. And we all had this unique identity of numbers. So I was 228. And then I would just use the first name, Swarnim. My surnames were rarely used. So you never knew what background a particular person came from. So I had, the crown prince and the other princes in my batch, or 1 or 2 years senior to me. And then in the Hindu caste system, you have so-called untouchables and Dalits, or from different ethnic stock, thrown into this campus. We'd eat the same food, study the same way, dress in an identical manner. And that's how we grew up, right? So when we came out of the boarding school experience and saw the society at its worst, in the sense that divided identity, ethnic and caste identity, it was pretty surprising for us. But this practice of inclusion was what was done at this school. So I went through that experiment. It was a British funded school. So we had 5 or 6 British teachers. The headmaster was British until the time I left. So that sort of oriented us towards a British kind of academic system. So I did the Cambridge O and A levels after doing the national school leaving certificate exam of the Nepal government. And I did fairly well in that exam. I was second in the whole country in that exam. So that set me up for the future opportunities. And so I did the O levels and then A levels. A clear departure in my case was all the good students, supposedly good students, were supposed to take, go into the sciences, either become a doctor or an engineer or maybe pilot as a third option. I don't know what the societal bias is like here in Sri Lanka, but that was really the expectation. So me and a friend actually rebelled constructively, and the school was kind enough to allow that to happen. So there were just 2 kids doing economics and mathematics A-levels, and we had 2 British teachers flown in from England to teach us, right? So that gave us an amazing opportunity to really, and this was the Cambridge sort of system board, took the exam, again, competing in an internationally comparable sort of examination system meant that we could be assessed against British students, right? So that meant we were then set up for competing with British students for entrance into top British schools. So I went to the London School of Economics on full scholarship. So
And what kind of family are you coming from?
I come from a very simple, modest Hindu family. My father is a teacher, and he came from Gorkha. At the time, there were no roads, and he tells me of these stories of, they had to walk for 5 days from the village to Kathmandu. And obviously, he, boarded there and, got his education. But a typical farmer's family. My grandfather was completely illiterate, didn't write a single word, right? Absolute farmer, but was middle class enough to send his sons to Kathmandu to get educated. So our way, our path out of poverty was education. Then my father got education, got his master's, later on spent a year in England as well. But he got an opportunity to teach at the same school that I went to, which had been set up in the early 70s. And so that set us up, right? Then I got an opportunity to study at that school. And through sheer hard work, results, as they say, success begets success. So one academic success then put pressure on us to perform at the next level. And that's how I ended up at the LSE. And after that, things opened up globally for me. I took a degree in economics at the LSE. My tutor there was Lord Meghnad Desai.
Okay, yes, of course.
The famous one, yeah. But Charles Goodhart, later at the Bank of England, and very famous, Christopher Pissaridis, Danny Kwa, now Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School. Amazing array of top professors who really inspired, right? And Amartya Sen, I could see him strolling around because he used to spend a few weeks at the LSE on his way to Oxford from Harvard or wherever. So
did Friedrich Hayek have a big impression on LSE?
Actually, so I was there in 93 to 96. And those are the years that were the centenary years, right? So Ralph Dahrendorf, this famous German-British scholar, actually wrote a biography of the London School of Economics. And I read, cover to cover probably twice. And so Hayek was obviously, before he went off to Chicago, was a great presence at the LSE. I think The Road to Serfdom was written when he was there, or possibly later. But it was also the hotbed of left-wing labor politics. LSE, the 68 student rebellion was actually Sorbonne and Berkeley and LSE, right? And Meghnad Desai actually started as an avid Marxist thing. Now he's obviously shifted to the right, and the wiser and older he's got. But Lionel Robbins was another famous presence. And Harold Lasky, who was this famous political science professor who wrote The Grammar of Politics and had a tremendous influence on a whole generation of Indian students who studied. Nehru, of course, was at Cambridge, but Krishna Menon and all the others were at LSE and were. So I think you can trace that legacy. So the Fabian socialist views of the LSE were what these Indians post-independence practiced and probably held part of their country back. But there's a famous anecdote.
That was a bit of that in Sri Lanka also.
I think so.
Same thinking.
Yeah, in Nepal and Sri Lanka, we tend to look at India for a lot of experiences. The Indians were borrowing from England or the Soviet Union, the 5-year plans and the planning whole exercises and all that. But the LSE was more known as a left-wing institute, also because it was set up by the Fabian socialists in 1895. It was Bernard Shaw, and Beatrice Webb and Sidney Webb, who were the stalwarts of the Labour Party. The only departure was, 1917, the Soviets went the Bolshevik route, pretty violent and all that. But the Labour Party has a constitution, 1918, which was written by the folks associated with the London School of Economics. And they have the famous Clause 4 of the Labour Party, which is that the production, distribution, and exchange of the means of production, distribution, and exchange would be collectively owned or something. And Hugh Gateskill wanted to get rid of it in 1959. He couldn't. And this is what Tony Blair got rid of in 94, finally becoming electable, for many number of years, right? So this is amazing how ideological hysteresis sort of just persists. And when, unless leaders come at the right time and, reorient the ideological baggage, it ends up shaping the fortunes of an entire nation.
So, what do Fabians believe?
So they do believe in a peaceful evolution, but they are essentially socialists, right? I think the origin is actually from the Roman times. So there was some general Fabius who believed in attacking and defending in a very incremental, sort of guerrilla-like way. So Mao Zedong and Lenin, the violent communists believed in radical overthrow of regimes and bloody revolutions, right? The Fabians, England was already practicing, multi-party democracy, so it was possibly inconceivable in England to have that kind of thing. But they showed an odd fascination with the Soviet experiment. But they couldn't go for that, so hence they said, okay, we'll participate in elections. And once we come to power, we will implement socialist policies. So that hotbed of Fabian socialism is what the Indians borrowed. Nehru and B.P. Koirala in our case in Nepal, and maybe the early Sri Lankan, the Ceylonese
too much
socialists.
Of Oxbridge.
Oxbridge,
I think it went to Oxbridge also.
Yeah.
So Swarnim, what attracted you to economics?
That's a great question. And so as I said, the social preferences were really for the smarter kids to become doctors, right? A safe, predictable, prestigious career. Nothing could go wrong, right? Once you're a good doctor. Society always gets sick and you have plenty of business, it's prestigious and all that. So that was the first preference. Then if you couldn't get into medical schools, maybe engineers. In my case, it was a gentleman, a teacher, an English teacher, actually he's Welsh, Ray Morgan. He was sent, through British Foreign Aid to teach at this school. So I was studying O-levels, classic science student, right? Physics, chemistry, maths and all that, destined for either of these two tracks. Then Ray Morgan this was a residential school, all teachers lived on campus. And after the school was over, around 3, after we had our tiffin, he would take some of us, 5 or 6 of us, and put on these, videotapes on his old Panasonic VCRs. This was in the 80s, right? And, this was in 1991. And show documentaries on Margaret Thatcher and the reforms that were happening in England. Or that happened in the 80s. I think Maggie Thatcher was kicked out by then. But then there would be these documentaries on Marcos and the White Elephant projects in the Philippines. And this tremendous rot of bad governance and dictatorship and all that, right? And there would be some documentaries on Africa. And that just excited me, right? My God, this is it. This is what I want to do. If I'm a good doctor, I would probably do 20,000 excellent surgeries with a few mishaps on the way. If I'm a great engineer, I would build good bridges, good roads, and all that. But if I'm a good politician, a good economist, and a good administrator rolled into one, I can shape the fortune of a country, right? So that got planted in my head. My God, this is it. And there's another English teacher, Andrew Wild, and he also sort of Cambridge sort of physicist. He's one of my headmasters. And when I sort of tested him on this, what do you think, of this new alternative stream? And he only said this, I vividly remember it. He said, what was the population of India at the time of independence? Now it's 1.5 billion people. At the time, I think I just threw in a guess, maybe 300, 400 million people. How many British ran that country? I said, I don't know. Well, less than a few thousand. That's the power of administration. Of course, it was a colonial administration using the Indians themselves to, divide and rule, and all that was there. But at its heart was the quality of the civil service, the quality of the infrastructure, leadership, rule of law. You govern through laws and regulations. That sort of struck with me, and I said, yeah. And having come from that humble background in Gorkha, already gotten a good educational sort of background at this British infused sort of school. Said, yeah, I want to do this. I want to do this. So move into the social sciences, get excited about the world, changing societies, reforming economies, improving the lives of people. But it was not well articulated then. I sort of said, okay, rather than a doctor and engineer, these are safe professions. This sounds more risky. And actually, that came into the decision matrix pretty soon. Okay, I would want to study economics, but the societal expectation of economists or the societal reputation of that profession in Nepal wasn't the best, because the best students would go into the sciences. So Ray again did something interesting. He said he used to play golf with a hotel manager of Solti Oberoi. There's a famous hotel in Solti.
Of course, I know her.
So the Oberoi. And apparently he told this gentleman called Amar Singh, Amar, I have these two kids who are very promising, and they want to study economics, but they're really fearful that they won't get scholarships into Western or non-Nepalese universities after A levels. Instantly, Amar Raz apparently said, okay, you recommend 2 kids every year and I'll send them to at least a very good school in India, right? So that gave us that sort of insurance cover. So the worst case scenario is we would go to India, right? We wouldn't have to go to some government college in Kathmandu, should we fail. So that once that possibility of that ignominy was resolved, I think we just took the plunge, and I went to the LSE, my friend went to Harvard, and then I went to Harvard later on.
So you finish LSE, and then what do you do?
Then I hung around for a few months. I had an interesting stint at the BBC.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, BBC Nepali World Service was just across the road from the LSE. So I had a pretty good command. The school that I went to, Budanil Kantha, made sure that we had very good Nepali. We could write and speak very good Nepali. But also we did these international exams, so our English was also reasonably good. So the fact that you had a bilingual command of both English and Nepali meant that I got a good job as a broadcaster at the BBC at the age of 21. Right? And once I graduated from LSE, they said, why don't you, you're pretty good at this, why don't you stay on? So I did that for, I think, 7 or 8 months. So I used to broadcast live Nepali news and current affairs and do all these odd bits of translation, but then of course I knew I was not going to be a journalist, right? So I said, I'll go back to Nepal. I'll go back to Nepal, work for 2 years, at least 2 years, explore the country. And I was only 22, 23. And then for my master's, I would want to go to the United States. And I would do my master's, and then my career would take off. But eventually, the reason I went back to Nepal, even at that tender age, was I had that thing. I would go back to Nepal and be active in some form, in some aspect of public life. Didn't quite foresee then that I would take the plunge of electoral politics, maybe a techno-political positions, which I did actually for the last 9 years. I was sort of in that sphere at the Planning Commission as advisor to politicians, and a loose affiliation with political parties was maintained, relationship with politicians was there. And I was the member of a Planning Commission, became vice chair of the Planning Commission for brief stints. And when I was out of government, I led a think tank in Kathmandu. But
so you go back to Nepal, and what do you do?
So I then joined the UNDP, United Nations Development Program. And again, there was this amazing, so I've had wonderful mentors and colleagues throughout my career, right? So Carol Long, a very charismatic sort of a development leader, she was there as my boss, and she really gave me opportunities. And we did Nepal's first Human Development Report in '98, and suddenly got thrown in to work with a very illustrious former finance ministers, scholars, and so that again gave me that exposure in understanding my own country. And then I traveled a lot. But as planned, I spent 2 years in Nepal, working at UNDP as a young national officer. And then I, those 2 years gave me that confidence and sort of told me what I exactly wanted to, the internal voice, that this is the direction that you need to go. And again, as luck would have it, Jeffrey Sachs started a brand new program at Harvard. And Ricardo Hausmann joined a year later. So both of us know Ricardo. So Jeffrey Sachs starts this program called the MPAID at Harvard Kennedy School. And it was so perfect a fit for me, right? Somebody who wanted a very rigorous training in development economics, but wanted to come out in the real world of practice and practice development, and not be this scholar or a professor at an ivory tower, right? But wanted that foundation that is comparable. So MPID at the Harvard Kennedy School, as originally designed, was taught at the PhD level. But the second year was you do all these courses at the business school, at the public health school, Tufts, and all these neighboring MIT. I did a course with Rudy Dornbusch at MIT business school, Sloan Business School, right? So it is an amazing 2 years. And after that, I was positioned for a career in international development, and I immediately joined the World Bank. This was 9/11. The world was changing, and then I quickly shifted to a job with the United Nations Development Program based in Vietnam. I thought I was in my mid 20s. This is not married then. This is the time to see the world, right? So this amazing job on trade issues. Remember Seattle WTO conference, then Doha round of development under the WTO, World Trade Organization, had happened in Doha in 2001, just after the 9/11 attacks. So trade was a hot topic at the time. And they were trying to refashion WTO into this, vibrant multilateral trading order. China had just joined the WTO, and very exciting period. That didn't last long. After the 2008 financial crisis, this became off the agenda, and after COVID, all countries have turned inwards and very protectionist. But though that was the right time to sort of focus on trade, and my professors at Harvard, Ricardo Hausmann, Danny Roderick, Jeffrey Sachs himself, did a lot of work on trade. Jeffrey Frankel, who had just come out of his stint as the Council of Economic Advisors for Bill Clinton. So Andres Velasco, who later became the finance minister of Chile. These amazing professors had been lined up. Kaushik Basu used to be flown in from Cornell. He was at Cornell, but Harvard said, we don't have a teacher good enough on micro development, economic development. So Kaushik Basu would fly in from Cornell and teach this course. He would land on a Monday, teach 2 courses, and fly back on Tuesday afternoon. So that exposure to the best and the brightest, just gave us that intellectual confidence, and also reaffirmed that this is exactly what I want to do in life, right? I want to be a good development economist who is well-rounded, but hasn't forgotten his roots, right? So is really concerned of how would I apply what I've learned and what I've seen across dozens of countries in international work and travels to Nepal and the rest of South Asia, and to make a fulfilling career. And this is what I've tried to straddle, right? So international organizations, 12,
So
15 years.
you finished Harvard, then you go to UNIDO, and I believe
UNDP, yeah.
And then I believe that you went to Australia also.
So UNDP I spent almost 5 years
Okay.
at UNDP, running a Asia Trade Initiative. So again, the WTO kind of trade agreements. So I picked up a lot of legal stuff. See, I trained as a trade economist, specialized at Harvard, right? With all these, academic stalwarts. But the real world of trade was actually crafted by lawyers. And I had, again, another amazing mentor, Murray Gibbs, a Canadian, who was about to retire from UNCTAD. UNCTAD, the specialized body on trade issues.
I think there was a famous Sri Lankan who was quite instrumental in UNCTAD.
Absolutely.
Gamini Korea.
Yeah. Gamini Korea. Absolutely. Yeah. You're right, yeah. And so Murray Gibbs was about to retire, and UNDP had, brought him on secondment. So this guy who had drafted, several annexures of international agreements like GATS, General Agreement on Trade and Services, etc., was there as my boss in Vietnam, of all places, right? So again, this massive learning experience and all that. But I did that for 5 years. But here's the twist. After 2 years, they wanted to shift my office. It was a regional office. I covered 25 countries in the Asia Pacific. They moved it to Kathmandu, but it didn't work out. There was some riot, and we're still under that civil conflict. And that office got moved to Colombo.
Oh, okay.
So I ended up spending 2 years, wonderful years, in Colombo.
When was this?
This was just after the tsunami, Boxing Day tsunami. So 1st of January 2005 to a little after 2007, I was in Colombo. Then that's when I took the call. I said, okay, Harvard did say you don't need a PhD after this. But I sort of felt that, no, that rite of passage of writing solid, rigorous papers that you would publish in journals, I sort of wanted to do that, right? I mean, in the world of development practice, yeah, the Harvard training was enough, more than enough. And as I said, the first year was all PhD econ, right? But I somehow felt, okay, can I do a PhD, go through that motion of a sort of a serious scholar, yet not go into academia, still come back into national government or international organizations. And that's when Australia came as an option. I was about to go to the UK, but there was other factors that took me to Australia. Again, full scholarship, that a very prestigious Australian Leadership Award that John Howard had just introduced during the mining boom and all that. And so I spent 4 years in Australia on paper. The reason I say this is after the first year of coursework, I went back to Washington, D.C. And it so happened that the work that I was doing at the World Bank dovetailed into my PhD thesis. So I was evaluating, FDI regulations in 87 countries, analyzing data, and colleagues before me had done, detailed questionnaires. So I was processing the data, writing a paper. So investing across border, just like the doing business indicators is for internal entrepreneurs. This one was investing across borders for FDI, and so that ended up becoming a substantial chunk of my thesis. So, but then I did go back to Australia.
And what did you do your thesis on?
So I did 5 papers,
right.
3 major papers, and then an opening and an intro. And it's called Essays on Policy Reforms in Trade, in Investment, and Taxation. So essentially 3 publishable papers formed. So thesis you can do 2 ways. One is like a book-like thing, you do a whole book thesis, publishable book. The other is sort of very sharp, publishable journal quality, peer-reviewed papers. So I did one on export survival, what determines export survival. If Sri Lanka is exporting a shirt to the United States. And trade data, the beauty of trade data is so disaggregated, right? This is, if you have 200 countries, 6,000 products at the HS 6-digit level, you can even go higher, and then take 5 decades of data. You're working with millions of data points. So that richness really sort of fascinated me. And you could use trade as a window to larger competitiveness issues, how your economy is doing, right? Because if you're a good exporter, if you're a good producer, if you're a good employer, that's a window to your larger economy. So trade fascinated me in that regard. And,
was it at the ANU that you connected with Premachandra Athukorala?
Yes. So Premachandra is a famous Sri Lankan economist. Trade is his forte. And so initially, Martin Richardson was who I was looking at. He was trained by Avinash Dixit at Princeton. And he himself is a New Zealander. So after getting his PhD at Princeton, he went back to Australia, nearer to his home perhaps. So he gave me the theoretical foundations of trade economics for my PhD. And Premachandra Athukorala was the policy guy, right? Sort of with very much a hands-on experience across Asia and a phenomenal command of the academic literature, right? I would go and see him, and then he would say, oh, there's a 79 paper by, Ian Wilson or somebody, just look up in the Journal of Economic Literature, or EJ, Economic Journal that comes out of the Royal Society of Britain. So I had a wonderful time with Premachandra, and we've kept this association going. Most recently, co-authoring a paper on Sri Lankan crisis last year.
So, Swarnim, for the benefit, because Advocata's real focus is on free markets, why should developing countries embrace free markets? Now, Danny Roddick has been giving a bit of a counter narrative to that. What's your view?
I've come to a sort of a healthy equilibrium, I would say, that is suited for at least my country, right? So definitely wealth creation, there's nothing, it's a necessary condition for overall progress, right? Without creating growth, without having vibrant enterprises, without having these rules of the game that foster competition, that fight against anti-competitive predatory behavior, monopolistic or oligopolistic tendencies, and that sort of the rule of law that shapes economic behavior towards greater competition, production, international engagement, no country can prosper. I absolutely believe in that. But there is this other side of societies like mine, in Sri Lanka, like you were mentioning the other day, that you guys didn't have to struggle for your independence, and that has shaped society in a particular direction. If certain America came out of a revolution, Soviet Union, was born out of a revolution, China came out of a revolution, Vietnam came out of a revolution, that possibly shapes countries in certain ways. Ours is we're very proud that we've been an independent country since 1769, the oldest nation state in South Asia, Nepal, right? But we've been tucked away in this rugged Himalayan territory. And even the Brits, we fought a war and they nominally beat us, but in the end they didn't want to take over. There was nothing there. But they then started importing our soldiers, and that's been for 200 years one of our main exports, export of labor. And so I've really felt, but a society that is so rugged, remote, landlocked, with nothing economically active going on except subsistence agriculture, that is also based on rain-fed agriculture. There's no modern irrigation or anything. A society like that, yet so diverse, and with this narrow elite that has captured all institutions, this politically and economically extractive history of over 200 years. And the society is so diverse that there is something called structural discrimination. Some societies, some groups have been permanently sort of suppressed. So we need to invest in lifting everyone up. But how do you invest? You don't fight over a small pie. You need to grow the pie. That growth of a pie has to come from pro-private sector, pro-investment, pro-technology, pro-world engagement. The smaller you are, the more you need the world for. But that wealth and the surplus that you generate has to be reinvested in a socially egalitarian in a manner, because your history is so unique and so fractured that if you don't cater to that, then you're going to imperil this larger project of wealth creation anyway. Because
so it's something similar to what the president here has been advocating, like a social market economy.
Absolutely, right. Absolutely. So sometimes, when you just look at, when you use the word free market, people might say, oh, just focus on the economy and all that. But there is this twin wills of a thing. So very much a vibrant private, and this is something that we haven't done in Nepal. It's the socialist legacy was very much alive until the 1990s, and now nominally there have been some economic reforms, largely nudged through the IMF and the World Bank, etc. And there have been some reform-oriented ministers, but this has quickly perverted into crony capitalism. And we need to clean that up, right? Not the kind of free market economy, pro-competition, whoever has the best idea and talent ought to succeed, excel. That doesn't exist. And that has to be fixed. But whatever wealth and the surplus we generate has to be reinvested in the size of in a viable welfare state. I keep on using the word viable. We can't afford to be this populist and reckless, right? And many wonderful countries that have gone that route, have had very tragic lessons. But we need to, because and Nepal, remember, Murtaza, is one of the poorest countries in Asia still. And
So your per capita GDP is what?
we're a $42 billion economy, 30 million people. Do the maths, it's 1,400. So after Afghanistan, which is a bit of an exception, we remain the poorest country. So we're very proud of the social and the political advances. Very free country. It's probably a beacon of sort of freedom in the entire South Asia. Although there are also sort of the darker sides. But economically, we've just been stagnant, just a laggard. And that's because we've just not invested enough on things that would get the growth triggered and then sustained for a substantial period of time. This famous growth report from Michael Spence and others that documented the success of the 13 miracle economies, 9 of them in East Asia. At least 7% growth for 25 years. That's what you need to pull off a miracle within a generation or two. The West did it over 200 years, right, after the onset of the Industrial Revolution. But the post-Second World War catching up has been miraculous, but it's all evident in the numbers. At least 7% growth, and there's a nice mathematical logic. You double the GDP every 10 years. But if you sustain that for 25 years, then you get the kind of leap and this rapid, unprecedented catch-up that we read about in economic history books. And only 13 countries have done that after the Second World War. Even if we just replicate half that success, Nepal would be in a much better place.
So Swarnim, you mentioned that you were primarily trained as a trade economist. For the benefit of the larger audience, what is the benefits of trade? Let's go down to the very basics.
Yeah. Take Sri Lanka or take Nepal. What do consumers want, you and I? We want to consume the best products at the lowest possible prices. And take off your nationalistic hat for a while. You don't care where it's made, as long as it's absolutely the finest at the cheapest possible price. Now, if you're an economy that is very large, and India comes to mind, the United States come to mind, Brazil comes to mind, they're so large that they can possibly do many of the things, produce almost everything that they want. Even the mighty United States or the mighty Soviet Union couldn't produce everything that they wanted. But let's assume that they can produce many things. But it is almost the case that they wouldn't be able to do it at the finest quality or at the cheapest price. Right? So trade allows, that opens that door. Now that even the mightiest and the largest economies cannot be self-sufficient or autarkic, as we use the word in trade economics. So if you care about consumer welfare, citizen welfare, giving them, this might sound a bit materialistic, but this is again a necessary but an insufficient condition to improving our living standards, right? Sometimes in South Asia, we tend to be carried away and think that everybody is like Gandhi, who is happy with his loincloth, self-made and all that. That's not at all the case, Steve Jobs used to say, I want to design products that consumers don't know yet that they want, right? So we're wired that way, and trade opens that possibility. Since you can't do everything yourself, so do what you can produce well, do it very well, so that the rest of the world wants your products. So Ceylon tea, produce as much as of it that you want. Even high quality, the higher end garments that Sri Lanka does very well. Tourism, affordable beaches, high quality beaches in Sri Lanka. You have some competition, but it's a fairly unique brand. Do that very well, sell that, earn enough sort of convertible foreign currency, and consume everything else that you can't produce yourself. Only trade allows that. So when you look inwards and when you erect these protectionist barriers, you are limiting people's options and people's consumption baskets and, in a sense, your welfare bundles, right? And suppressing the potential living standard increases. So having said that, one may need to be, that's the strategic direction, but one may need to be tactical at times, right? Sort of, if you see a promising industry come up, you may need to protect it for a bit. If you really feel, objectively that this if it can be saved from being decimated by a much more competent competition for a bit, and then suddenly it can take off, then there's some space for enlightened industrial policy. But overall, I think it has to be engagement with the rest of the world. Do what you do best in a good way, in volume, scale it up, attract FDI. Just do the products that you're good at, to be able to import and to be able to consume, and even on capital goods, even for larger development catch up. So I don't want the emphasis to be just on consumer products. You don't do machines. You don't do you need to bring tourists into Sri Lanka. You need Boeing, and Boeing is only produced or Airbus produced elsewhere. To be able to afford those, you need to sell as much of the products that you're good at. But if you look inwards, and if you just say, oh, exports are good, but imports are bad, then you are in this 16th century mode of mercantilism, which really didn't work, right? And the whole WTO construct, as Paul Krugman frames it, it's enlightened mercantilism at work, which is basically saying, yeah, you may sort of begrudge imports, you may celebrate exports, begrudge imports, but since you can't do just that, then the world equation doesn't work that way. So to be able to export more, you also allow imports to come in. So that enlightened mercantilism is what is at the heart of the multilateral trading order. But that too has been distracted and has been gone off the track in recent years. But again, back to your question on trade, it's a wonderful thing. It's a voluntary exchange. It's a win-win outcome if you do it right and if you follow the rules of the game.
You do mention about your time in Vietnam. Today, Vietnam is the poster child of development. I think you were at the correct stage in the 1990s. What was it like then? And what was the political discourse, and how did they make these decisions, that has allowed them to, harvest those things that they did correct 20 years ago today? Especially, I'm very curious about the industrial policy that they followed and the trade policy that they followed.
Yeah. It's a great example, right? So Vietnam hadn't made it to that list of the 13 miracles because the Spence report came in 2008. So I was there 2002. So the first time I went, so I lived there for 2.5 years. An amazing time to be in Vietnam. Just a bit of history on Vietnam, right? So they were a replica of the Soviet Union. They were a Soviet protectorate of sorts. The US was kicking them, they defeated the Americans, they forced them out, that unified. The original, so 75 was when North and South Vietnam united. Very hardcore, orthodox communist party, very liberal, that came to power and tried to enforce, collectivization in agriculture. Everything was state-owned and all that. A classic Soviet replica along the Mekong, right? We could say that. But what happens in 86? Glasnost and perestroika, and suddenly gradual withdrawal of all these generous subsidies, that they used to dole out to Cuba and Vietnam and North Korea and all that. That gradual withdrawal was evident, forced these countries to also reform. So Vietnam did in 86 what is called Doi Moi, like Gai Ge Kai Fang in China in 79, right? So these are all historical milestones. Slowly opening up, decreasing the reliance on the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union obviously collapsed 4 years later. And Vietnam was forced to stand on its own. US was still heavily hostile. And US being hostile means the rest of the West was hostile. The only Western presence they had was Sweden, this innocuous presence. And so that forced them to reform. But what had been built during those economically very depressing years, but socially quite advanced, and this is, you have to give credit where it's due. They did invest in education. They did invest in health. They did invest in infrastructure. They did invest in female empowerment and gender equity. Look at this across the formerly socialist economies. The gender female dimension just pops out, right? And when I was living there, you could see it, the gender parity, equality, empowerment and all that. So they all turned out to be excellent prerequisites for a country ready to take off. Now, what needed to be added were some of those open market policies. Are you ready to engage with the rest of the world? Are you ready to invite foreign capital, foreign personnel, foreign ideas? And are you ready to now mix it in? But you are still very poor. In 1990, Vietnam was at the same level as Nepal. Now they are $4,000 per capita, 3 times Nepal's per capita. But at the time, they were dirt poor. Yet the prerequisites were already there. So when, and they started with fairly rudimentary industries, garments, electronic assembly, footwear, and all that. And they also are very rich in agricultural products, right? So coffee just took off, fisheries, shrimps, catfish later on became...
I mean, some of these things are not native to Vietnam. Even they are one of the biggest players in cashew. I wonder what the specific agricultural policies were that made them so successful. Even coffee, they became one of the largest producers.
Arabica, they just borrowed it from somewhere else. So this is it, right? The work ethic and the cultural thing, Sometimes it's controversial to sort of wade into these matters, but it's there. The society is so uniform, so homogeneous. 85% is the single gene, unlike our country where and don't forget, China was on that way. So politically they're identical, right? Single Communist Party rule. So Lao PDR, Vietnam, and China, just connected to each other. So politically the same. And China was beginning to show what it could do under the sort of the tight grip of the ruling Communist Party. Can you loosen the societal and the economic forces, unleash those potentials while retaining the political grip? Soviet Union didn't manage that, right? It imploded. So the Vietnamese copied the Chinese, and in a sense, they mimic one large province of China. 80, 90 million population then, now about to inch towards 100 million. So it was that. So Chinese experiment already, 79, the whole late 80s, 90s, it was evident. So that was being mimicked by Vietnam. But maybe it's smaller than China. They would be able to do things even more efficiently, right? And slightly differently. But they do have that animosity with the Chinese too, So suddenly they were probably more pro-Western, than China would eventually become. And the South China Sea issues, and then under Clinton, the situation was normalized. And then Clinton actually visited Vietnam during the end of his second term and absolutely normalized the relationship. US-Vietnam BTA, bilateral trade agreement, was signed. And that forced Vietnam to liberalize, get off these protectionist communist shackles.
So
forced reforms.
Could the reason why they were able to implement many pro-trade policies is that the vested interests in the country were relatively weak because they started from such a low base?
Yeah, that's a very good observation. There was the Communist Party. There's a narrow elite, tiny elite there. And the rest of the country was uniformly poor, right? Even the idea of a private property ownership was alien. I remember 2002 was when they introduced a new company act, and all these mom and pop shops would come up and all these registrations and all that, right? So the lobbies were non-existent. Whatever existed in the form of industrial production or trading enterprises were designed for the communist era and were all absolutely state-owned. So reform meant actually, reforming the state-owned enterprises to either do joint ventures, either get demolished and let others come into place. And who owned these SOEs? The communist elite. So once the elite, the leadership decides to go in a certain way, that was made possible. Now we as Democrats, don't have that luxury. You have to take everybody along and all that. But this is where the whole discourse on maybe it's dictatorships.
Vietnam also must have had, because under the communist system, you generally have a very strong state.
Yeah.
You have a capable state, right? Yeah. Everybody, all the most capable people would have wanted to join the state. So
that's correct.
Yes, the state capacity would have been very high to do the reform.
Absolutely. That's a very good observation, partly because you don't have other competing options. So the best and the brightest, the more ambitious ones, would have to join the Communist Party. I know a few good ones who refrained, as a matter of conscience. They just couldn't join communist parties. but yeah, that used to be the case. So that is said of the Chinese Communist Party too. Internally it is meritocratic. Internally it is very competitive, right? Only based on performance you get to rise, and the top leaders, the Politburo or whatever, have been tested and groomed in a certain way. The only drawback is you don't have plurality, right? Just you have to do it within that one single outfit. But you are right, the state capacity is much stronger. Even simple garbage collection, I used to be awed by they used to pick garbage 3 times a day in Hanoi. And there was an opera house that the French built, immaculate condition, world-class operas. And what is the per capita income? 3,000 at the time, 2,500, 3,000. No country at that level of income would be able to sustain what are classically middle class or middle income kind of aspirations. And this all boiled down to a bit of that French colonial legacy history, but that socialist orientation of the entire bureaucracy, the security apparatus, and the political elite. And once they've decided to get things done, they would get things done. Of course, there's a lot of mismanagement, cronyism, corruption, and since you don't have a free press or a vibrant civil society, very little of that is not known, right? So that's the drawback, the darker underbelly of fairly authoritarian societies. But on economics, oh my God, the pace of change. I would go off for 2 or 3 weeks on holiday or foreign travel. I would come back and wouldn't recognize my own street. The upheaval, in little commercial activities and changes. It's just such a vibrant, dynamic society.
Another point I would like to discuss, Swarnim, about Vietnam is you said they achieved very high gender parity, very high female labor participation, and a lot of female entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Any observations on that?
So give the credit to the socialist policies, right? Everyone is equal. Let's practice it. Having said that, you still, there's still that thing. The glass ceiling is still there. You look at the top, Politburo lineup, hardly a single woman, and you may have a token representation here and there. Even large companies, not so much. And in the rare cases where you see a woman CEO, it's often dynastic, right? So that is there. Murtaza, let me reveal that my wife is Vietnamese.
Okay. Okay. You never told me that before.
And
so you met her there?
So I know the society very well.
Okay.
Her grandfather was actually a very good friend of Ho Chi Minh, the father of Vietnam. But he never became a Communist Party member. But Ho Chi Minh wanted a very suave, polished, Western-trained politician to be at the head of the education ministry. So he became Minister of Education for 29 years. He got his first, he was Vietnam's first PhD in, I think, anthropology or the social sciences from the Sorbonne in Paris. And so he became the face of Vietnam during very adverse times, right? When the rest of the world was ostracizing Vietnam. The only friend they had was either India or the Soviet Union, And so I know the society pretty well.
And maybe lots of the right kind of policies in education because they punch way above their weight class.
Relative, again, everything is relative to per capita.
On even the PISA score, they score very high, right?
Maths, science, wonderful. And
so they were conscious policies.
Oh, absolutely.
But even the parents push their kids, right, to excel.
That comes from the cultural work ethic, right?
Okay.
I think that's there, right? And the grit that we have to excel. And remember, they have had 1,000 years of hostility. First with the Chinese, then with the French, then with this brutal, the war against the Americans. And really, after 75 is when they breathed, more comfortably, and then started building their country. But the first 10 years were awfully wrong again. Under this very oppressive communist regime that resulted in partial famine as well, and none of this could be reported. So 86 pro-market reforms through Doi Moi, the rest is history.
So whilst you were in the UNDP, any other interesting countries you came across that people in Sri Lanka should look at, or interesting examples of policies that countries followed?
Well, I covered Asia Pacific.
Right.
So it's a vast terrain. Sri Lanka was cited often as a country that got its the human development priorities right. I think women got the vote 1931. The initial investments in primary health, primary education, etc. Earliest reforms in South Asia, 77 government, UNDP and all that. We used to mention those. But soon enough, I think a lot of the cautionary tales, the ethno-nationalism, populism, bad governance, this toxic mix also stalled. I wouldn't say ruined, stalled the progress here. Thailand was another example where they excelled in agriculture, in industry, and services. So I used to think the only region, not even a country, the only economic unit that has excelled in all these three, agriculture, industry, and services, California comes to mind. Right? And then Thailand always awed me by saying, my God, these guys are really good in what they do in agriculture. On industry, Toyota was there. And services, the hospitality industry, the health industry, even education, and something in common with Nepal we used to be monarchies, and both were not colonized. Right? And so Thailand was interesting. The Bangladesh in the early days, again, how they defied the adversities, the odds. So even until the 2000s, Henry Kissinger said,
it's a
lost case, basket case. And for decades, it seemed that way. But over the last 20 years, at least on the economic front, there's a lot to complain about the way politics is being run. But economically, I mean, there's nothing nobler and grander than lifting tens of millions of people out of poverty. And that's where this goes back to the earlier discussion on the power of good ideas, power of economic reforms can lift an entire country across generations, and that's the most meaningful contribution that one can make, I think, and that's where economics plays a big role. So Bangladesh, I think, is also a good example there.
So let me push you to the most important part. Now, what are you doing now?
I'm now an elected member of parliament.
Okay, so you keep aside your international career as an economist, and when do you go back to Nepal? When was that?
2014. So something interesting happened in 2014. Right. I was a senior economist at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. My son was just 2 years old, born in New York. And my wife and, with a 2-year-old son and myself, almost 40 years in age, I said, okay, now I've done so much already, been to all these places, now let's settle down in Washington, D.C. Let's look for a house, in Bethesda or somewhere, let's buy a nice car. So those classic Western middle class, suburban sort of dreams were kicking in. That's when I left the US, because that seed in me that one day you will come back to Nepal and spend 10, 15, 20 years in public life was always there. And my wife was always supportive of that as well. And I didn't think it would come in 2014, but it came. And my logic then was, when I'm ready to go back, maybe the country won't be ready. It would have moved on. So there was a nice coincidence there. The Nepali Congress government had been elected, and a very reform-oriented finance minister had come in. And he had asked another similarly like-minded former finance secretary to name a few people who could be brought back. And not that I was going to go back and save the country, but they were looking for a few reformers of the next generation, of the younger generation. So an offer came. They said, look, this government is going to last. Elections have just happened. They will be around for 4 or 5 years. You have a reasonably good prime minister. You have a very good finance minister. You work under that umbrella. You can contribute, and we know you always wanted to do this. It may not be the right time for you, so that's when I took the plunge, went back, became a member of the Planning Commission, which is the apex policy think tank of the government. So worked fairly closely with the Prime Minister is the head of the Planning Commission, but worked very closely with the Finance Minister. And the earthquake hit, remember the devastating earthquake? So that's when I was able to really test my own skills and networks and talent and what I could contribute to the country, and very proud of that time when we put together a post-disaster needs assessment in a record time, mobilizing like 200, 300, all the donors, development partners, did a very credible assessment of loss and damage as a result of the earthquake. 9,000 lives had been lost, but in terms of property, businesses affected, we quantified a very credible estimation. Then we went to the international community for a pledge, secured 100% of the public pledge, designed an appropriate institution for reconstruction over a defined period, 5 years. A wonderful thing. That's when I saw the power of government, right? It's not well-paying, tremendous sacrifice on the personal finances, etc. And people like us, have to be upright and all that. But the power, that awesomeness of legitimate government authority that you can use and deploy to do good for your country. That became a bug, right? But of course, then that's tied with the whole political cycle, and I left in 18 months. I thought I would serve for 4 years, but I had to leave in 18 months because the Prime Minister who appointed me changed. And then so I resigned on moral grounds. Then 9 months later, I got picked up again, became a member. And then I became a vice chairman, which was the top position in the Planning Commission. But that was just a brief stint, 6 months. And then the government changed again. Then I've been out of government, and I then became an independent sort of economist, doing some international assignments and also heading this think tank, which is Nepal's oldest think tank, set up in '79, called IIDS. And it was passed from the old guard to us, to me as the executive chairman then. And then 2020, when COVID hit, I got called by UNDP in New York to become the chief economic advisor for the whole region, Asia Pacific. And Kani Wignaraja, who is a Sri Lankan official, I worked very closely with her. She's the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, in charge of UNDP Asia Pacific. But my family I left behind in Nepal. The move in 2014 was fairly permanent. This one was temporary, so during the COVID years. But that also was a wonderful stint. I ended up co-editing a book with Kani on the pandemic implications, right? What did this mean? How do we figure this out? How do we make sense of this of it all? And it's called The Great Upheaval, and published from Cambridge University Press. Just got out last year. So then I moved back to Nepal, and this time I thought, okay, now I would take the plunge into politics. But the party that I was close to denied me a ticket because I'm fairly vocal against corruption issues, and the top leadership, which is totally corrupt and inept, they didn't like it, right? And others they could probably co-opt, buy off, threaten. With me, with all these international experiences, they probably thought, no, this guy can't be tamed, right? So they said, no, they denied me a ticket, even though one faction of that party, supposedly the good guys, wanted to give me a ticket to run, from any of the 3 constituencies that I had wanted, but I was denied. And so I said, okay, I'll accept it. So then I'll just do more of the public intellectual work, think tank, international assignments here and there. I'll hang around and wait for another 5 years. But at this, just 4 months later, there were other ugly incidents that happened that disgusted me. Then another opportunity came up where a new political outfit called the Rashtriya Swatantra Party, National Independent Party, just 6 months in existence then, had become the 4th largest party, swept the elections from urban, youth-conscious sort of electorates, got 20 votes, and the leader of that party, Rabi Lamichhane, became Deputy Prime Minister and Home Minister in one swing. There were ups and downs, he had to resign, contest the election again, but there were by-elections 4 months later. So both he and I ran from neighboring constituencies. So that's when I ditched the Nepali Congress, thinking that it would be incorrigibly sort of difficult to reform, and as long as the current guard was in charge, and that was going to be a while. And I thought, okay, yeah, the demography is shifting. It's a young country. The diaspora is big and influential. So let's, and if you want to do the deep-seated reforms against bad governance, unleash all those, economic reforms that will grow the pie of the national income, it has to be a fresh start. So that's where I'm engaged now. And I chose a constituency that was actually not mine. I wasn't born there. I didn't grow up there. So it was a huge gamble, to defect from a well-established party, join a new party, pick a constituency is traditionally hostile to newcomers. It had been a bastion of the Nepali Congress, yet I had a landslide win. And that's what reaffirmed my initial hypothesis that the country is ready for change, for much better governance. Status quo is completely unacceptable, and we can't be this economic laggard South Asian basket case for many years longer, because the exigencies of the demographic change, the geopolitical shifts that we see happening here, rise of India, China, US, all that, and climate change also coming in to exert a lot of these pressures. We're the custodians of the Himalayas, the mighty Himalayas. Waters flowing out of the glaciers from the Himalayas, support directly or indirectly the livelihoods of almost 2.5 billion people.
So your party, what does it stand for? Is it a centre-right party ideologically?
So it's a social market ideology. We are, so there is the manifesto, and there is the party's constitution, so which has a particular direction. It upholds the current constitution of Nepal, which is fairly social democratic or democratic socialist in its orientation, because remember, we had to accommodate these rabid communists, even the Maoists into the fold, at the same time make sure that the overall architecture is plural, liberal or democratic. So it is an odd compromise of sorts.
And this you did have a new constitution,
2015,
right?
Yeah.
And you made sure that it's secular. The constitution is secular.
So there are 3-4 major changes with this new constitution, because we're unwinding this civil war, right? So we got rid of the monarchy a few years earlier, but we codified that. So we became a republic after 250 years of being a monarchy, a bloodless coup, if you like. We became a federal republic. So that was a demand from the Madhes segment, constituency that borders India, and they felt Kathmandu had been a centralized unitary state that looked down upon all the marginalized people, etc. So that was a strong demand. That there's a lot of disenchantment now with the way the federal experiment is going, but nonetheless it is a federal setup. And from a Hindu country, even though Buddha was born in Nepal, we have 4 or 5% population is Muslim. Christianity is also a notable presence, but largely a Hindu-Buddhist society, became secular also. And also very inclusive in its design. So 1/3 of the parliamentarians have to be women. 40% of the local government officials are women. There's reservations for women and ethnic minorities in the civil service, in the police. So in all organs of the state, we are practicing that inclusivity, and that's enshrined in the constitution, often written down, often quantified in how.
So it's very progressive thinking. Was there a lot of internal debate?
There's internal debate, and the communist parties and this party that came out of the revolution or this armed conflict was pretty dominant, right? It couldn't achieve its goal. It wanted a Stalinist one-party state. That it couldn't get. But it did give up arms and come into the peace process. And so on the social side, it did impose a lot of its progressive ideals. On the other hand, the Nepali Congress and the status quo parties that had fought for a plural multi-party democracy didn't allow the communists to trample on those very ideals. So it was if you say, it's a nice combination of fairly progressive goals, constitutionally enshrined, a liberal democratic architecture. But where they missed out is on the economics. To sustain all this, you need a vibrant economy. Otherwise, you can't sustain federalism. You can't sustain the largest. You can't sustain to have a generous welfare state without the economic dynamo that is also active. And the constitution is fairly agnostic, if not hostile, to the private sector and all that. And that's what we want to change. So when you ask me about our ideology, we are a good governance party, so zero tolerance to corruption. So unlike the old guard and the current incumbents, who are all compromised and corrupt, as in the rest of the developing world, we will be because we are new, like a startup mode, we can institute those disciplines. And I think will be seen as a clean, meritocratic, new political party that is more aligned with the aspirations of the youth. At the same time, we are pro-private sector, pro-investment, ready for engagement with the rest of the world, leverage the diasporic wealth and talent that is now fast spreading around the world. 500,000 Nepalis in the United States, 300,000 in Australia, and millions in the Gulf as temporary migrants, etc. So I think we are closest to their aspirations, and but we will play by the current constitution, so uphold the plural, democratic, liberal order that is enshrined in the constitution. So if you'd like, we're not for regime change, we're to change the conditions of the country through better governance, better economic reforms, and that will then percolate or instigate other reforms in the civil service, the way private sector behaves, the way civil society is organized, and then of course health, education, social protection, environment, climate change, the way we do our physical infrastructure. A lot of this is economic governance, that undergirds how well you work.
So you probably will play a leading role on the economic side, that if your party gets into government, what would your top 3 priorities be initially on the economic side? What would you do?
So getting the fiscal house in order is very important, right? We're not as heavily indebted as Sri Lanka, partly because we are too poor to be credible to borrow externally. So nobody would lend money to us. And in your case, you almost had 40% of the foreign borrowing from private markets. We only rely on heavily concessional multilateral lending from the World Bank, ADB, and similar. And slowly India, China are also lending, but the more onerous commercial terms. But that's not an issue. Yet, our revenue base is still weak. And
so you have revenues to GDP of how much?
It's actually, the ratio is high, but it's very fragile, right?
Okay.
I saw the Sri Lankan figures, less than 10%, which was, ours is more than 20, more than 20%. It's almost like middle income levels. But once you peel off the layer, the top layer, you see that it's all remittances, which is, for a fairly populous country, the highest share in the world.
So what is it at?
So it's about $10 billion, right? And
on a
$40 billion economy,
wow.
25%.
So Sri Lanka is about 7 to 8%.
7 to 8%.
That is very, very high.
Exceptionally high. And so this is what I say, right? When people talk about Kerala and Sri Lanka and Philippines and El Salvador as heavily dependent, or Bangladesh as heavily dependent remittances, but relative to the size of their economy, it's within reasonable bounds. Nepal, even if you halve that ratio from 24 to 12, you're still at Filipino levels,
right,
which is very high. So, and that's what's sustaining, the livelihoods of the people. But that is also having the Dutch effect, and the Dutch disease, and production is being displaced. Everything is trading now, so that easy money flowing in. We import almost everything, from toothpicks to Boeings we import, and you would tax that imports heavily. Customs, VAT, excise, and then that's what runs the government, a bloated government. Something I could relate to when you discussed Sri Lanka yesterday. The size of the civil service, the size of the health force, the education force, the security forces is what our domestic revenue can sustain. But your expenditure plans are way higher. This year, I think almost $15 billion of budget was announced. Revenues is less than $9 billion. And that gap has to be filled with deficit financing. Fortunately, not as reckless. Our central bank is much more responsible.
But it's not an independent central bank.
It is, the Central Bank Act is fairly strong. So in the sense that you can't, some governments have tried to fire the governor, and the court has reinstated them twice, right? So that's a good sign. On the other hand, it's not truly independent like in New Zealand or even Bank of England, in the sense that it's the finance secretary still sits on the board.
We got rid of that in that new law.
Okay, that's a good. So I think that's the direction we need to go into. But the fact that you can't fire the governor once he's appointed or she is appointed, the probability of him or her serving the full 5-year tenure, and that gives stability, that gives authority, unlike the rest of the government apparatus where things are so unstable. Even a government that had a 2/3 majority couldn't last its full term.
Is your civil service independent also, or is it under the control of the politicians?
The entrance, the modality is very meritocratic.
Right.
We may not attract the best and the brightest because they tend to go overseas or even the tiny private sector that we have. But nonetheless, the Public Service Commission is still one of the...
And you have permanent secretaries.
We have permanent secretaries, right? Okay. So that civil service is fairly good. They come in meritocratically, but because everything else in society is so corrupt, and your political masters are so corrupt and inept, and the bureaucrats too, sort of, even they come through this competitive process, after a few years, their ambitions grow and they want to amass wealth. So a lot of corruption is also being enabled by the bureaucrats, right? Actually, all the official procedures are enabled by bureaucrats. So if you don't have a willing bureaucratic setup, even the politicians can't do corruption in such a brazen manner. So in that regard, I think the quality of our civil service has deteriorated, but the Public Service Commission has done a good job. And like the Central Bank, Public Service Commission, the Army, it has its darker side, but the Army nonetheless are the last standing quality institutions back home. Otherwise, everything has been eaten up by bad governance.
So you mentioned that the fiscal house is one of the items that you would major one that you fix.
And then so the imbalance between expenditures and revenues. So that would then give us a sort of a surer, a firmer footing to then unleash the infrastructure financing that we badly need, right? So the roads, the ports, to connect us, the digital infrastructure, and crucially the energy infrastructure. Remember, that's our big goal. So then the second would be to identify, narrow down our new sources of economic growth. So in my head, it's very clear. It's clean energy. That might lead, as we were both relearning at Harvard, the green reindustrialization, right? Now you have to relocate to where the wind is, where the sun is, where the clean energy is. So suddenly I'd ruled out Nepal as this home for a viable industrial sort of location if we followed the 20th century mode of production. But with the new opportunities emerging in an era of decarbonization, there's some hope there. So clean energy, green reindustrialization with production of things that are nonetheless tied to the global value chains, or at least the regional value chains. So India, Bangladesh, possibly Sri Lanka, eastward. So that has to be a second thing. Tourism, but much more high value. Tourism, maybe even extending towards landscape marketing. High value agriculture. We can't do things at scale, but niche, organic, high value stuff that could even be, I'm talking about turmeric and Sichuan pepper and, honey and tea and very high value to weight ratio kind of products, maybe even amenable to air cargo kind of thing. And finally, digitalization. A huge boom is awaiting on digitalization, and that's our ticket out of this poverty trap, because as a landlocked country, we would never be able to do the things that India does or Bangladesh does or Vietnam does, right? Because they will be 20% more efficient than us just because we are landlocked, and distance and weight was punitive. So whatever is distance-less and weightless is our ticket. And just before I came to Sri Lanka, a few weeks ago, we did a very interesting survey trying to take stock of the digital freelance workers. How many companies are there catering to the world economy? How many gig workers are there? And you wouldn't believe what we found. 70 years of state-led support for so-called merchandise exports, we haven't crossed $1 billion yet. Unofficial, just the sheer activity of the last 3-4 years, $500 million of IT exports. 66,000 digital freelance workers already doing stuff, sitting in their living rooms and engaging with the rest of the world economy. So,
Do you have a lot of digital nomads who come?
not who come, but this is something we could easily make Nepal attractive, right? Naturally air-conditioned country, beautiful. We need to take care of our air pollution problem, but
You can certainly locate a lot of data centers.
absolutely.
You don't need so
Clean
much of
hydro.
cooling, and you have green energy.
Yeah. So that's it. So those 5 or 6. So my second priorities would really be to unleash. So what, simplify procedures, make it really easy for domestic and foreign private investors to come in and tap these opportunities that are, where Nepal would be able to do some great things. On digitalization, nothing would stop us from going from $500 million to 5 billion to 50 billion. It's unlimited, right? So what would it take to get there? So that reform, and we've identified around 24 to 30 existing legislation that we need to either scrap or reform wildly, radically overhaul to get that, to signal to investors that, okay, now we're ready for business. It's no longer the Nepal of the old years, and so that would what a new government, a credible finance minister, a credible reform-oriented, pro-good governance party, pro-reform party should be able to do, and that's very much high on the agenda.
And finally,
the third would be some complementary inputs, right? So public infrastructure, human infrastructure also. There also we've sort of lost the plot. The kids are going to school but not learning much. There are health posts 10 minutes of walking distance away, but there's nothing of quality on offer. And so those social infrastructure that enables, going back to our Vietnamese story, the enablers of a rapid catch-up. If you don't at least keep pace on the minimal investments there, you won't be able to reap the growth dividends here just through reforms and money flowing in. You need to have your citizens empowered to that level, and we're talking very basic levels at this stage.
So Swarnim, Nepalese 100 years ago, your geography would not have been very favorable. Today on one side you have China and on one side you have India, the two largest populations in the world, and perhaps two of the largest economies in time to come.
Yeah.
How do you play this? How
That's
do you exploit this?
Thank you for asking that. It's so I always think that this 20th century model of production and exchange really punished us, right? Really punished us. And people sometimes compare Nepal with Switzerland. They forget that Switzerland is looks landlocked on paper, but they have access to the Rhine, and 50%, which is a navigable river, and 50% of the Swiss population lives in low-level cantons with access to these navigable rivers, right? So technically not landlocked, and you're surrounded by Germany and France, and you're in the heart of the largest common market in the world, right? So nothing to compare with Nepal, which is tucked away in the Himalayas, beautiful but very fragile and remote and costly to do anything. I see the next village just there across the river valley, but it would have taken 10 hours to get there, in the old days. And I come from a similar village called Bunkot in Gorkha. So 20th century model of production, world trade, just punished us, no hope at all. 21st century, if you focus on weightless, distance-less, if you focus on proximity to markets, if you invest in the right forms of connectivity, there's possible. So energy connectivity, digital connectivity, air connectivity, even to India now, road and even rail and even waterways, the Ganges coming up all the way to the Himalayan rivers is what feeds
So are the Chinese building a railway track into Nepal?
No, they are building into Tibet.
Right.
But the one that has been proposed up to Kathmandu is not viable and it's not moved ahead. There's another one being discussed from India to Kathmandu through Raxaul, from Bihar and all that. But on the China-India, there's a nice nuance there. So when you look at a map, it looks like, oh, China is just up there to the north. But the real China, the dense China with population, it's distance, density and division, 3 Ds that matters in economic geography. The real China, where most of the people live, are really far.
Right.
Even on an aeroplane, it would take 3 hours, 4 hours. Chongqing is 3 hours away. Shanghai is 4.5 hours away. Beijing is 5-6 hours away, right? And there's this famous Huanyang line that splits China into two halves geographically. So 50% on this side, Tibet and Xinjiang and others, and the other 50%. Guess what share of the Chinese population live on this side of the 50%?
Probably about 70-80%.
How much? 7 to 8?
70 to 80% on the more popular side.
On the more popular side. You're getting there, but you'll be shocked. 94%.
Wow.
94% on this side, the denser side, the side that is really far away from Nepal. On the least populous side, it's only 6%. So sometimes our folks, forget, and when we were picking battles with India, we sort of forget this basic arithmetic. But that doesn't mean we don't get connected with China. We absolutely have to get connected with China, because another number. How many cities in China have a population of more than 10 million? Half the size of Sri Lanka. Cities that are half the size of Sri Lanka in China, how many? 16 or 20. How many cities with more than 1 million population? More than 150. So the trick there is, and these guys have, even the average per capita income in China is now $12,000. But the middle class folks, the richer folk in all those vibrant cities in China, it's probably already European levels. Get them on a plane and, let's get them to Nepal. So air connectivity, let's invest in that. Train, it's very, very tricky. Roads through this Tibetan plateau, very tricky. If you can do it over time, that's fine. It's always good to have alternatives. But who's going to fund it? What are the opportunity costs, etc. On the Indian side, you fly for 40 minutes and you will effectively cover 500 million people. You fly for 1 hour, you cover 1.5 billion people, right? And the modes of connectivity on the southern side would have to be different. Air, of course, but there we can do rail, we can do roads, these massive expressways. So this connectivity to both China and India through differentiated modes of connectivity, what will it do? It will bring in middle class tourists, into a beautiful, peaceful country where people are very nice and all that. Rich history, culture. The access to concessional finance, the Chinese and the Indians are able to lend, badly needed for our infrastructural catch-up and larger development catch-up. FDI, there are segments, and 100% of Nepal's energy production will be clean. In an era of climate change, that's a huge draw. And for a number of more years, we'll still be an LDC, and there's a transition period as well. So if foreigners invested in Nepal and produced things that are tied to the clean energy value chain, the green value chain, we can still, or they can still export duty-free, quota-free provisions, right? Unfortunately, that window is narrowing, but then all that means is Nepal would then have to negotiate trade deals that will allow that separately. So with the European Union, we would probably have to go through the GSP plus and honor all these conventions, etc. But with a vibrant market like Japan or even the United States, we would have to do a dedicated BTA, which would then allow countries to invest in Nepal, use it as a platform to export back to these rich markets at highly concessional tariff preferences.
And is there an estimate? You have a lot of hydroelectric potential. Is there an estimate of, what can be on economic grounds, what can be tapped?
At least 40,000 megawatts.
Wow, that's a lot.
And we're just at 3,000 now. We're just scratching the surface. So we can go up to 40,000, absolutely commercially viable. But there are colleagues of mine who say we can go up to 1 lakh, 100,000. Okay. Now, the seasonal variation of Nepal means that we have to trade that with India. A lot of the projects that the private sector is doing is run off the river. So it's not dam projects. There's actually just one that was built 50 years ago, and there's another one coming up in my constituency in Tanahu. But other than that, we haven't done storage projects. And unless we have that, what happens in Nepal is because it's geographically skewed, and there's the rainy season and the dry season. In the rainy season, we produce way more electricity than we need. In the winter season, the lean season, there's a deficit. So with India, we have to trade, right? So export the surplus, import during
so
the
of
deficit.
the 3,000 megawatts that you have, Do you have a sense of what proportion of your production gets exported currently?
Currently, we're just scratching the surface,
Okay.
right? Actually, just to get the transmission lines built, we built the first one, Dhalkebar Muzaffarpur, and actually that helped end our crippling power cuts.
So you import power also?
We import now, but we've also begun to export.
Okay.
So that's the paradox, right? We built all these international lines eventually to export to India, but right now we're actually importing much more than we're exporting. But we've also begun to export. So both two-way flow is going on, but in asymmetric numbers. But we plan to build 7 such international transways connecting to the Indian grid, and eventually also get connected to Bangladesh, and that has also begun. 50 megawatts have been allowed. Unfortunately, India is a monopsonist for us. And
But you don't have a land border with Bangladesh, right?
we
So
don't.
you have to go across India.
Absolutely. So it has to be through the Indian grid. So the Bangladeshis have shown interest to invest even in a power plant, a dedicated, let's say 700 megawatt Sunkosi hydro, which they could then take back to Bangladesh. But you need to go through that tiny chicken neck of Indian territory of 18 kilometers to get to Bangladesh. And without Indian goodwill, or
So
Indian
it's only 18 kilometers, is it?
it's only.
Okay.
But we can't build anything there.
Right.
So Indian goodwill is necessary to trilateralize or even quadrilateralize all these bilateral. Remember, so there's Nepal and India are trading. Bhutan and India have a vibrant energy relationship. Bangladesh and India have one. Now there's even talk of getting some of that electricity through undersea cables to Sri Lanka. I don't know technologically how viable that would be. But making a sub-regional or even a regional electricity grid and electricity market that you trade in real time, that's the direction we're headed towards. So that would then incentivize the private sector, the investors, to really play for that market. And one good thing has come out recently. India has promised to buy at least 10,000 megawatts of Nepali electricity by 2030. So in a sense, that implicit guarantee is there, but I don't know if these things can be reneged upon or can be tied with geopolitical pressures or concessions in other areas, as we were discussing the other day. But nonetheless, that is a nice gesture on the part of Prime Minister Modi, knowing that they have the need and we have the potential to produce that, and it's a win-win outcome, and it's good to see a petty game not being played, at least for once.
Swarnim Waglé, it has been a fascinating conversation. We wish you all the best, and we hope that the next time we speak that you're going to have a senior economic leadership country in your country. All
Thank
the
you,
best.
Murtaza. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Likewise.
Thank you.